In so many ways, we take for granted our ability to harness unseen forces for our benefit and even our enjoyment. I mean, you're watching YouTube right now. We generate and shape the flow of the electron. We grab radiation from the air in the form of Wi-Fi. We use some form of that radiation to warm up our food or even peer through our own flesh on various wavelengths of that radiation. We can detect voids in the Great Pyramids with muon detectors, and we can sense gravitational waves that form as nightmarish voids collide in the black depths of space. All around us are invisible occult forces, and the great natural philosophers of the past few centuries have instrumentalized them to a degree that would have delighted and horrified our ancestors. But tuning to, catching, and instrumentalizing occult forces is far, far from a modern notion. Indeed, noticing the correlative and causal relationship between the phases of the moon and the tides, it became reasonably obvious to ancient peoples that celestial forces rain down on us, literally pushing and pulling vast swaths of impossibly weighty water. Through the ages, keen observation led them to conclude that all astral bodies, not just the moon, bore direct effects upon earthly affairs with a dizzying array of specificity. Thus, the occult science of astrology attempted to read in the signs of the heavens what fate held for those below the floor of heaven. But what if such astral forces, such astral radiation raining down always from the heavens, otherwise shaping fate, could be captured, tuned, and instrumentalized? Thabit ibn Qurra, the great polymath and among the last of the Hermetic pagans of Harran, set out a brief textbook of just such a technology in the form of the Talisman. His brief book on talismans would become one of the most influential magical textbooks in history, and recent manuscript discoveries have shed even more light on its popularity and diffusion. So, let's explore the Hermetic science of capturing astral forces and instrumentalizing them in the form of the magical talisman. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this video, then I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or taking a look at some of the merch that we have here on the channel. It's like black metal styled. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to sort of get the lay of the land, then make sure to check out my study guide. That'll give you access to reliable scholarship in the field. And if you're interested in historical books of magic or historical books of the occult and the mystical, check out the bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment. But now, let's turn to the Hermetic science of the talisman, as recorded and developed by Thabit ibn Qurra. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As I mentioned in the introduction, until very recently, the vast majority of learned people held the perfectly reasonable belief that celestial objects and their transits were either signs of impending events or were literally the cause of those events. The combined symphony of that causation was simply known as fate, or destiny, or fortune to the ancients. Thus, astrology, or the science of understanding those signs, was an attempt to either read those signs to prepare for what was coming. You can think of the old Stoic philosophers who often turned to astrology as a way of steeling themselves internally against what was coming externally, or it was a way of manipulating destiny in such a way as to avoid the worst that was coming and sort of ride the tide when times were good. But the reasoning must have gone something like this. If astral objects like the moon are literally able to push and pull vast amounts of water, then there must be some causal transitive relationship between a given astral entity and the object acted upon. That is, there must be some specific force or forces imposing that very fate upon our terrestrial globe. But what if, rather than just reading the heavens to predict what was coming as destiny, and thus being us the mere passive recipient of such astral forces, we could capture those astrological forces and then instrumentalize them at our discretion? In the same way that a mirror can capture one's reflection in the light and allow one to beautify oneself, perhaps an object could be made to capture specific astral forces such that their power could be purposely redirected, thus bending the forces of destiny to one's will. Those objects are simply known as talismans. So let's distinguish between a talisman and an amulet, though there's going to be some overlap here, so don't get too wrapped up in these categorizations. An amulet is a purpose-built magical object whose power originates in the natural substance of its composition or with the application of further magical technology such as inscriptions or magical signs, suffumigations, incantations, or just the focus of the mage on the object. A talisman, however, from the Greek teleo via Arabic, meaning to complete or perform or to fulfill, has its power totally from artifice. That is to say, the talisman is empowered totally through how, or in the case of specifically astral talismans, when it is created. However, as we'll see, there's sufficient overlap between amulets and talismans that equivocation on the terms isn't surprising in the least. Though the central text, which briefly, though pretty systematically details the nature and composition of talismans, is Thabit ibn Qurra's On Talismans, often known from its Latin title, De Imaginibus, though it's Imaginibus with a Y rather than an I typically in medieval Latin. Thabit was a 9th century polymath, complete genius. He was a skilled translator, mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, a medical doctor, and a natural philosopher. He apparently just didn't sleep, whose works helped to lay the foundation of the illustrious center of learning, probably the most advanced center of learning in the world at that time, the Bayat al-Hikmah in Baghdad. However, Thabit was originally from Harran, the last center where ancient paganism and ancient pagan wisdom, especially wisdom associated with the occult sciences of alchemy, astrology, and magic, were allowed to persist despite the Islamic conquest, and despite the Christian conquest before that. The people of Harran were given some special dispensation along with Christians and Jews because they were considered a al-Kitab, a people of the book, specifically being rubriced under the title of the Sabians. Mentioned 3 times in the Quran, the exact nature of the Sabians is mysterious, but the term became kind of an umbrella for various kinds of groups, from the Hermetic astral religion of the people of Harran down to today's Mandaeans, the only Gnostic group to survive from antiquity. Further, we don't know a great deal about the Sabian religion of Harran. The city was actually razed by the Mongols in 1260 and it was fully abandoned by 1271, such that the religion seems to have gone extinct, and we don't have really first-hand books on sort of what their religion was. However, clues do remain in works like Ibn Washia's Nabatean Agriculture, which hasn't been totally translated to English, but the book The Last Pagans of Iraq is probably the best study we're going to get right now. That, along with some pretty fanciful tales in the magical textbook The Picatrix, probably a good idea for a future episode to really get into the Sabians of Harran, but the most important of the Sabians of Harran that have come down to us are Thabit ibn Qurra and his later contemporary al-Battani, another spectacular genius of the time. Harran seemed to have a main cultural export, and that was the geniuses. But of the mountain of works translated and written by Thabit ibn Qurra, what's germane for this episode, and for this channel for that matter, is his short work on talismans, which is in some sense very unfortunate considering that's the most well-known thing to us in the West, despite the fact that he wrote so much other than that. While the text was originally composed by Thabit, the origins of the astral technology behind it probably go back as far as Greco-Egyptian and Hermetic origins. Nevertheless, the text does become associated with Hermetic wisdom pretty early on in the Latin tradition, part of a vast, complex body of literature known as the technical Hermetica, though Thabit clearly composed the text as a kind of primer on the creation of talismans. The text survives in a variety of forms, including some recently discovered ones, detailing really that it was an incredibly popular text. The original Arabic text, or perhaps Syriac, that was Thabit's native language, is lost. Kinda lost. More on that in just a second. The text principally survives in two similar, though distinct Latin editions, known again as De Imaginibus, translated from the Arabic as part of the larger 12th century Renaissance. At least 61 known manuscripts of these editions survive. 61 known manuscripts. This attests to the great popularity of the text through the centuries. An adaptation of the text with the inclusion of more specifically magical elements was penned by Adelard of Bath. That's the same guy that introduced Arabic numerals to Europe, so that was kind of a big deal. His text is in the form known as the Liber Prestigiorum Thebetis. Prestigiorum having an interesting sort of etymological history, as the word for talisman in Latin typically means like trickery. Further, a brief quotation does survive in a Greek manuscript, and parallels of the text can also be found in the incredibly important magical textbook known as the Guide al-Hakim, known in Latin as the Picatrix. And more recently, Gideon Bohac has discovered two manuscripts of a Judeo-Arabic translation of the text in the remains of the Cairo Geniza. Judeo-Arabic is Arabic written in Hebrew letters primarily. Interestingly enough, the same scribe that made those translations also read out the most substantial magical manuscript we have in the Geniza as well, the Sefer HaRazim, or the Book of Secrets. So my guy was apparently the community's go-to sage. And the fact that it had been translated twice indicates that he was probably doling these out, perhaps even selling these manuscripts of talismans. While the Judeo-Arabic translations are far from perfect, they did allow for something relatively spectacular. When comparing the Judeo-Arabic text with the original Arabic of the Gayat or the Picatrix, scholars are able to realize that the Gayat was actually quoting from Thabit's original text in Arabic. Thus, with some degree of probability, scholars have recently reconstructed what we think is a good bit of Thabit's original Arabic composition, long thought lost. I don't know about you, but stuff like that just, it makes me giddy, folks. It makes me giddy. Not gonna lie. But academic giddiness aside, what's actually in this text? Thabit's text includes a preface followed by a series of talismans for various ends and employing a wide range of astrological timings to create, with a final chapter for creating a mold to create said talismans, along with a very brief little conclusion. The astrological theory and practice ranges from relatively simple, simply ensuring a proper ascendant sign for the creation of a talisman, to knowing very complex birth charts and casting charts at the time of proper interrogations. Though, in general, the two most important astrological timings are the circle of the signs along with the circle of the houses, especially the role of the lord of the house for those signs. Though he also makes use of lots, especially the lot of fortune and wealth, because we all want talismans for fortune and wealth, and the distinction between signs which are commanding and those which are obedient, and that sort of dialectical counting between various signs. With these elements combined, astrological timings can be extraordinarily granular, allowing for an incredibly high degree of talismanic fine-tuning, all which presupposes an expert astrologer armed with a solid textbook, probably something maybe like Abu Mashar's textbook, or maybe even Thabit ibn Qurra's summary, along with a book of ephemerides. Of course, now all of that's just sort of point and click online or with software, but back in the day, that was not so easy. Finally, the text relies heavily on the Aristotelian notion of causation, specifically the notion of generation and corruption. You'll recall that for Aristotle, for something to become actual, there must be a potential for it to be, and then something must act upon it to actuate it or activate it. Specifically, form has to be applied to substance to individuate it as well. In this case, astrological and terrestrial conditions are the potential states which the talisman merely activates through magic. Secondly, any mixed state of combined form and substance will also be subject to dissolution if the form is divorced from the substance, as when a fire burns a wooden chair. This causal theory of generation and corruption, form applied or subtracted from substance, or various potentialities specifically activated by an agent, are at the very core of Thabit's theory of the exact metaphysical mechanisms by which talismans work. Now, the question is, if you don't accept an Aristotelian theory of cause, do these still work? I have no idea. But in the introduction, he tells us that learning geometry and philosophy are pretty useless on their own without also learning astrology, the highest science, which combines them all. Further, the apex of learning astrology is acquiring the talismanic art, whereby knowledge of the heavens may be instrumentalized. It'd be akin to learning about, electricity from a bunch of textbooks, but never actually making use of it. Like the Amish or Ted Kaczynski, God forbid. Thus, Thabit lays out 7 different types of amulets, depending on how you count them. There are actually maybe more in there, showcasing the range of applications of the talismanic art in a kind of graduated presentation. It's a kind of graduated textbook from relatively easy talismans to much more complicated ones. The first, for removing scorpions, involves knowing when Scorpio is ascendant, engraving the appropriate astrological information on the talisman itself in the shape of a scorpion, afflicting the ascendant as much as possible, especially in the house of death. You're trying to get rid of the scorpions, and then burying that talisman upside down with a short proclamation saying basically scorpions aren't welcome here. Interestingly, though, unsurprising, the metal of the talisman is of very little consequence. Tin is just as good as gold in this respect, so don't go making this out of gold. Again, this is a talisman and not an amulet. The metal doesn't really matter. The astrological timing does. The second involves a birth chart, so things are a bit more complicated, but a birth chart not for a person, but for a city. We're going to destroy a city with this talisman, so that really accelerated. Most famously, the birth chart that Thabit maybe has in mind here is the very city where he's probably writing this whole book on talismans, in Baghdad, whose birth chart was actually drawn up by the Jewish astrologer Mashallah bin Athari in 762. In this case, one afflicts various aspects in relation to the birth chart of the city you wish to destroy, and then you bury that prepared talisman in the center of the city. There's also a great little anecdote here about a dude that gets killed in the process of doing this, so don't. In good Aristotelian fashion, if you want to reverse that process or restore a city like Harran, one would do the reverse procedure. The symmetry here is unsurprising given the potential astrological conditions, and again, his Aristotelian theory of change. The third set of talismans now moves on to those involving elections for people, specifically for reacquiring lost wealth in the form of property or acquiring new wealth. In the first cases, 2 horary charts must be drawn, one for the person from whom the property was stolen, and the other for the thief, with the talismans created in a very specific condition of signs commanding and obedient. With both talismans created, they're placed face to face, they're wrapped in a clean cloth, and they're buried in the middle of the house of the victim of the thieving. Hopefully one's property is returned promptly. For becoming wealthy, only the birth chart of the person involved matters. The talismanic figurines are described a bit later in the text, however. The next talisman involves becoming generally successful and prosperous and introduces both the importance of intent in the process, but also casting the horoscope at the moment of the interrogation. So now we have specifically interrogation style horoscopes. However, if the horoscope indicates a poor outcome, no talisman should be cast. You don't want to make a bad or weak talisman, and especially one that would reverse one's fortune, and one must basically wait an entire year to re-attempt the process. But with the strong intent of the client and the proper astrological conditions, the talisman is cast, and its exact nature isn't made clear by Thabit, but it's probably one of these anthropomorphic talismans that he mentions a bit later on. It's at this point in the text that we have a short but technical detour describing the casting of that generic anthropomorphic talisman from a mold. That mold is described in the end of the text. It's probably this generic anthropomorphic talisman that is the rubric for most of them in the text. It's carved into the mold from head to feet, following the succession of the planets, with the exception of Saturn and Mars, along with the various lunar nodes. Simply put, metal of basically any kind is heated and cast into the mold at just the right correct moment, and voila, it's a talisman. He suggests that the name of the client should be written on the talisman, the base talisman cast under the ascendant of their birth chart, and their specific interrogation, if they're looking to get a question answered, in the houses of victory and friendship. Thus made, such a talisman can be used in the procedures involving anything from finding favor of royalty, bringing about love, and bringing about hatred. Again, as you can imagine, Thabit details the opportune conditions for those various elections, for those involved, both ruler and subject, lover and beloved, bro and hater, all of which you can find and consult in the book itself. Finally, he mentions that these are but a small few of the potential talismans that one can create. The only limits are really the terrestrial, the astral potentialities, one's astrological ability and imagination in creating the talismans. I mean, anything from safety, travel, health, and illness, even collecting fish, he tells us. Even collecting fish, you can get a talisman for that. Of course, the appendix then also briefly describes the details of the creation of the mold that you do to make the anthropomorphic talisman. It's basically just two stones ground together until flat, and then you carve the anthropomorphic image into it. Interestingly enough, there's no specific election mentioned for the creation of the mold, just for, of course, the casting of the metallic talisman. Thabit ibn Qurra's text on the talismanic art proves that brevity can really punch way above its weight. I mean, this text, as I mentioned, survives in at least 61 Latin manuscripts and is quoted in everything from Picatrix, Albertus Magnus, Ficino, and Agrippa's definitive 3 books of occult philosophy, making it probably among the top 3 most important magical textbooks of the Middle Ages. It's one of the texts that was simply on the shelf of every magus in Europe for centuries, despite having now fallen into relative obscurity. Of course, there are other such talismanic texts. I think one of my favorite is Pseudo-Ptolemy's on the images and the deacons of the signs, because it's kind of nutty. There are talismans in there for making women stop in their tracks and remove their veils, making people just break into song randomly, or just to start taking their clothes off. It's way more fun than any of this stuff. I mean, if I could just have a talisman to make people randomly break out into song, I'd be living in some kind of weird musical. Actually, that doesn't sound very good. But Thabit's text is very much a classic and should be studied with anybody who has an interest in magic. That said, there are 2 really great editions, or both are worth getting, frankly. The Warnock-Greer edition, entitled Astral High Magic, is a great translation of the 2 principal Latin recensions, along with a commentary more focused on how Thabit's book influenced Western esotericism. Great extensive quotations from people like Ficino and Agrippa. Also, it's really written by practitioners for practitioners, along with a couple of Thabit-inspired contemporary talismans included at the end to really show you how you can modernize this business of making talismans. So this one comes really highly recommended, especially if you want to make talismans. The Bohawk Burnett edition is much more technical from the textual angle and is frankly a tour de force of scholarship in that regard. Here, Latin, Greek, Judeo-Arabic, and Arabic editions and fragments and text are all collected into one critical edition, one Thabit powerhouse of a text. But it's published by Sismel, and so it can be a little difficult to obtain, but it's an absolute must-have from a scholarly perspective. Of course, there's so much more to cover in the history of magic, but Thabit ibn Qurra's on Talismans is an absolute classic. Like I said, despite the fact that it's not so well known today, it would have been on the shelf of every wizard for centuries. So, if you fancy yourself a wizard, or just academically interested in the history of magic, you need Thabit's book on your shelf. Until soon, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.